First of all, welcome everybody to our liberal arts lecture series, Decolonizing Nature and Remaking Society. I'm very excited to have Francisco Guevara here today to give his virtual lecture, How Do We Move From Here? Art Practices in Time and Space. Francisco Guevara is an artist, curator, educator, scholar, and he's based in Mexico, Peru, and Italy. Francisco specializes in Levinasian ethics applied to the design of cross-cultural artistic practices and the analysis of performativity in contemporary art practices. His experience spans more than 20 years of designing, curating, and managing art projects through visual arts education and international cooperation to promote social change. His essays and critical texts focusing on contemporary art practices and the artist residency field have been featured in numerous international publications. As a visual artist, Francisco Guevara investigates the historical construction of the differentiation processes and its relationship with the performativity of identity. Guevara is the co-founder and co-executive director of Arquetopia, a nonprofit foundation and transnational artist residency program promoting development and social transformation through educational, artistic, and cultural programs. And let's see, Carmen, anything you want to say to?
Yeah, sure. I'll just say hey to everyone. I did a cultural research residency at Arquetopia in 2019. I absolutely loved my experience. It was incredible. I learned so much in my stay there. And yeah, I'm just really excited for Francisco to be here as a transplant and to kind of share these experiences from Puebla here at RISD. I'll also go ahead and just drop a link to some of the work that I did there, give some context, and yeah, you can kind of just check out Arquetopia and what they do and all the wonderful programs that they have.
Cool, thank you. All right, well then we are very excited to hand it over to you, Francisco.
Thank you so much. Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Ariel, for a wonderful introduction, and also to Carmen, one of our past residents. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can begin with the presentation. Just give me one moment. Here we go. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank the Liberal Arts Department at the Rhode Island School of Design for this invitation. It is an honor to be here with you today. I have prepared a lecture titled, How Do We Move From Here? Art Practices in Time and Space, which could be more relevant to what we are experiencing in this world today. So first, about freedom. Freedom is not something that anybody can be given. Freedom is something people take. This is a quote by James Baldwin. And to desire eternity is to desire to perpetuate oneself, to go on living as oneself, to be always. Can one conceive of an eternal life that would not suspend time or reduce it to a contemporaneous presence? To accept time is to accept death as the impossibility of presence. To be in eternity is to be one, to be oneself eternally. And this is also a quote from Emmanuel Levinas, Face to Face with Levinas. So what happens when the ideal of freedom eclipses justice? When freedom breeds injustice? And I'm going to begin by talking more about my work as an artist. For the last 15 years, my work has been addressing class, specifically how class takes place through the technologies of the spatialization. And as a scholar, specifically since we established Arquetopia Foundation and its residency programs in 2009 about ideological distortions in the process of the face-to-face encounter, as the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas frames it, and the invention of place and history as a distortion of time and space. So I am sharing with you today three of my previous work. This is an installation that I did for the Albuquerque Museum at an AIA meeting, and it's titled Guadalupe, Tlecuantlaljope. And this is an edible installation and performance with coffee beans covered in chocolate, using vanilla, spices, and oranges to address national myths about mestizaje, immigration, and national identity. And through the years, I have been thinking about space, place, and class. And in 2009, I joined the University of New Mexico, specifically the seminar on the writing of art history taught by Dr. Kirsten Buick, which has become my mentor and also a board member of Arquetopia. And for the final project for the seminar, I designed the Garden of Earthly Delights. And these are 60 pounds of salt, savory and sweet cupcakes based on information provided by the participants of the seminar. And it's an edible installation addressing the theme of identity based on how it is performed according to self-identification and preconceived ideas about age, gender, ethnicity, and class. Here I am sharing some images of the process and the performance. It was a garden inspired, of course, by the painting by Bosch. And it is a garden made out of salt, and then in the middle it has a fountain with the food. And the process of the performance is how the viewers relates to the work and approaches the center of the installation, erasing certain designs that are placed within the floor and as part of the installation. Now, in the last 5 years, I've been investigating the problem of color and its historical context in connection to class, specifically indigo and other natural dyes and their use in painting. Most recently, I am now addressing the problem of the body as a vehicle that establishes history and place. So I have been using different kinds of maps, patterns, and fabrics that have been used as a limit of the experience of embodying and in relation to class. As part of the theoretical content of the presentation, I will share part of my journey of challenging the ideas, the ideals of freedom, and my struggle as an artist to confront art, specifically being aware that art history, and the art world in general is highly invested in the appropriation of labor, environmental extinction, and the celebration of extermination. And here we are looking at one of the paintings of the series titled Unraveling Empire. And it is indigo ink and oil on paint. It's a huge canvas. It's 6.5 by 9.8 feet. And I am using different forms of maps and different patterns for garments and textiles, thinking about how class has been spatialized throughout history and addressing these problems about how class actually takes place. And I will begin with this image of a monument to independence and a very important anecdote from my childhood. When I was 5 years old, I was sitting in the car while my mom was driving down Avenida Juárez, one of the principal streets in the city of Puebla. When we reached a stoplight, we were right next to the Monument of Independence that I'm showing you here. I looked up, glanced at it, and then asked her about the scale of the monument. Why was it that size, especially compared to other monuments of freedom around the world? And she didn't hesitate and responded, freedom doesn't exist, only the degree of injustice which exists and depends on the size of freedom we imagine. At that moment, it made sense and I was satisfied with her answer. However, I didn't necessarily understand the profound lesson she was passed on to me. Many decades later, when I was introduced to the work of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, I found her voice resonating within the question of freedom and the face-to-face encounter. And whenever I think about freedom, I think about a quote by Dr. Kirsten Buick, in places where imperialism has shaped societies, freedom is usually experienced at the expense of identified targeted groups. So this is a monument to independence in the city of Puebla by Jesus Contreras, and it was inaugurated in 1898. Jesus Contreras was a visual artist who became a prominent personality during the Porfirian era in Mexico. He collaborated with the casting of the famous monument to Cuauhtémoc in Mexico City in 1878, and was a permanent member of the Mexican exhibition team for the Universal Expositions. His grand prize at the 1900 Paris Fair for his sculpture Malgré Tout, despite everything, became one of the Porfiriato's greatest hits. Contreras studied at the Academy of San Carlos in Mexico City. He was a personal beneficiary of the official scholarship to modernize the national image of Mexico. And while in Paris, he worked with Guevara, one of the most important foundries, who in fact have produced several statues of liberty for different parts of the world. And Jesus Contreras, as I mentioned, he participated in the Exposition of Paris in 1889. This is the Aztec Palace, the Pavilion of Mexico at the Paris Exposition. And you will see that it features different elements of Indian monuments, specifically from Xochicalco and Mitla, which are very different cultures. The walls displayed modern bronze reliefs of Mexica deities, as well as historical heroes designed by Jesus Contreras. And here we have to think about universal exhibitions. As they became the spectacle of progress and modernity, an ideal rendition of the modern city organized through object lessons. The culture and order they offered was thought as atemporal and ecumenical, a controlled portrayals of cosmopolitan centers. The Universal Exposition of 1889 was a World's Fair held in Paris, France, as I mentioned, from May 6 to October 31st in 1889. It was the fourth of 8 expositions held in the city between 1855 and 1937. It attracted more than 32 million visitors. The most famous structure created for the exposition and still remaining is the Eiffel Tower. And here we have a closer look at Jesus Contreras' work. And this world as an exhibition, as Timothy Mitchell is framing it in his famous essay, The World as an Exhibition, was a place where the artificial, the model, and the plan were employed to generate an unprecedented effect of order and certainty. It is not the artificiality of the exhibitionary order that matters so much as the contrasting effect of an external reality that the artificial and the model create, a reality characterized by essentialism, otherness, and absence. These 3 characteristics are going to be very important to understand the notion of place. So I will continue to mention them as we think about the different images that I present as part of the presentation. The exhibition does not alienate us from the real work. It creates an effect called the real world, in terms of which we can experience what is called alienation. The world as exhibition means not an exhibition of the world, but the world organized and grasped as a thought as if it was thought to be in an exhibition. And this is, again, from Timothy Mitchell, Orientalism and the Exhibitionary Order. Mitchell addresses Edward Said's analysis of the geographic specialization of differences. And it's not merely an ideological distortion coming into the global political order emerging in the 19th century, but a densely imbricated arrangement of visual representations that organizes and produces the Orient as a place and political reality. 3 features define place: essentialism, it is understood as the product of unchanging essences; otherness, these essential characteristics are in each case polar opposites: passive rather than active, static rather than mobile, emotional rather than rational, chaotic rather than ordered. It also includes absences, that's number 3, and the Oriental opposite or other is therefore marked by a series of fundamental absences of movement, reason, order, meaning, and so on. The consolidation of the global hegemony, economically and politically, can be connected not just to the imaginary of Orientalism, but to all the new machinery that gave meaning to the world through its construction and representation, from museums and world exhibitions to architecture, schooling, tourism, the fashion industry, and commodification of everyday life. Now, the body in place. Michel de Certeau distinguishes place, the map or the representation, from space, the illegible, heterogeneous, contextually protean use of time and location. Space lives, place is dead. Space is actualized, place is described. Thus, time that has been made public through measuring cannot constitute space, even if we date it accordingly to spatial measurement relations. What makes it ontologically relevant is a specific kind of making present, in this sense, the body, which makes measurement possible. In other words, as Simone de Beauvoir asserted, the body is a historical situation and is a manner of doing, dramatizing and reproducing historical situation. As she said, quote, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, unquote. We have to consider that other is a verb, not a noun. Both space and time are relations that are contingent to the process of encounter. However, through ideological distortions such as race, class, age, gender, etc., space is imagined as place and time is imagined as history. Therefore, as Kirsten Buing points out, other, as so popularly conceived and so ineffectively theorized, is not a noun but a verb. And because identity does not exist, rather a process of identification that is constituted in time and through a styled repetition of acts in space. Other is not the embodied experiences of trans, gay, non-white, non-male people. Such concept instead is a process that is performative, relational, and participatory. It is a toxic, heteronormative formation resting in the ideal of freedom, which is created and recreated through place and history and the technologies of spatialization in detriment of very specific and targeted communities. So what is spatialization? Spatialization is the spatial forms that social activities and material things, phenomena, or processes take on. In his book, How Racism Takes Place, George Lipsitz explained how racial ideology, being a distortion, is place-bound. The lived experience of race takes place in actual spaces, while the lived experience of place draws its determinate logic from overt and covert understanding of race. To further expand, class notions function similarly through the geographic spatialization of bodies. Class determines the places people inhabit. It is not a choice. Because of practices that socially classifies bodies through space, class is spatialized, and it is learned, legitimator, perceived as natural, necessarily, and inevitable. Classist imagination takes place through the enactment of history and visual representations, relegating people's bodies to different classes and different places, producing unequal access to education, employment, transportation, and in general access to resources. And here I'm introducing Casa Paintings. And this is a very specific and important genre to the history of Mexico, which used to be the New Spain, but also that I have been studying for several years and is connected to my work. So Casa Paintings were a very popular and also unique genre of painting specific to the New Spain, which is now Mexico, that spans the entire 18th century, which is a very long time. The corpus is fairly large, as they were conceived as sets of 16 individual paintings and over 2,000 works of art were produced, which is an extraordinary pictorial output in comparison with colonial art and even European art. The most common explanation for this chart, The different permutations between three main social groups in colonial Mexico, natives, Spaniards, and other groups usually brought into the Americas as slaves, creating a very specific narrative of order. And Casa paintings are usually interpreted as a genre of art with an apparent contradiction, celebrating racial mixing while at the same time asserting the legitimacy of racial hierarchy. And this is from the book by Ilona Katsu, Casa Paintings. However, when we take into account the long-lasting tradition of spatialization, both from the Americas and European continent, the technology is more visible. All Casa paintings include references to landscape and domestic scenes, reinforcing the spatialization of class. This genre of painting will also eventually become a representation of the ideals of freedom, the crystallization of nationalism, and the consolidation of gender roles. Now, the relationship with nationalism and spatialization. In the 19th century, nationalism appears as a sentimental project imagining the nation's bodies in relation to the national body. This is why nationalism is contingent to gender, because the economic reorganization of modern societies requires separate spheres, patriarchal ideologies. They establish and imagine separation between a domestic or private sphere and a public or social sphere. This separation was invested in confining women to the domestic private spheres while also ostracizing other embodied experiences from the public sphere by arguing that gender roles were clearly delineated through biological notions and or patriarchal religious doctrines. As each sphere organized and controlled bodies, it also compensated them with economic or emotional power that gave political action significance and intimately linked these individual bodies to the national body. Nationalism then became also a form of spatialization because place is dead, then the nation requires bodies to recreate the fantasy that place is alive. Thus, the nation renders the body, and the body then determines the degree of freedom, quote unquote, that each one of us can experience. The Sentimental National Project continues to articulate a set of cultural practices aimed to evoke an emotional response, reproducing spectacles across race, class, and gender boundaries to situate the viewer's bodies in space in relation to history and place. So now we're going to look at four case studies of the body in place, which also refer to the cult of nationalism, to Mexico's cult of nationalism. And I open quote, "For artists, Mexican identity has become a commodity to be packaged, sold, and resold. Containment of its meaning has applied a patent copyright that allows for the theme fast food restaurants or the decoration of European suburban homes in a Mexican style purchased at the local superstore. A long-standing theme of this commodified Mexico, however, has been the association of death and Mexicanness, from the fascination with Aztec deities through the popularity of the Day of the Dead phenomenon. For many audiences and curators alike, death remains a key word in the evocation of Mexican culture." And this is from Oriana Badley, Teresa Margolis, and the Pathology of Everyday Death. This is the National Palace in the heart of political power in Mexico. And this is Diego Rivera's mural, The History of Mexico, which was executed between 1929 and 1935. This is a perfect example of how class becomes a place, how it's spatialized. This is the north wall of the History of Mexico mural at the National Palace in Mexico City. And what you can see is very recognizably in the background is precisely Mexico City. Mexico City transformed into a landscape. You can see the volcanoes in the background, you can see the whole structure of the city, and even the avenues that still remain today as part of the structure of the city. And I want us to think about for a moment about the idea of landscape. A landscape is a cultural image, a pictorial way of representing, structuring, or symbolizing surrounding. This is not to say that landscapes are immaterial. They may be represented in a variety of materials and on many surfaces, in paint, on canvas, in writing on paper, in earth, stone, water, and vegetation on the ground. It doesn't merely signify or symbolize power relations. It is an instrument of power and perhaps even an agent of power that represents itself as independent of human intentions. It naturalizes a cultural and social construction representing an artificial world as it were simply given and inevitable. And this is from one of Kristen Buick's essays on landscape and monuments. Here we see, and I'm going to go back to the slide. So we see the city of Mexico in the background. We see the landscape that creates place, but then we also see how class is actually being spatialized. We see on the left, the ruler of the Mexica Empire, Moctezuma, and then we see on the right, a prostitute. And this is going to be very important to how place is being actualized. How place is always being invented through class, and by place, I mean Mexico. So central to the composition is a woman in white. She is hiking her skirt and invites the attention of several leering men. Her bright red lipstick, elaborate costume, and long loose hair, described and illustrated in Aztec sources, heightened the wanton allure. Never one for the nuance, Rivera surrounds the lady with an aureole of calla lilies, which is something that Rivera used constantly as a coded image for female genitalia. And again, we see the contrast between the ruler and the prostitute and how Mexico City, which is the center of the empire, which is the center of the Mexican nation today, is invented as place. I want to show also this example, and this is a film by Roberto Gabaldon. We don't necessarily have enough time to look at the film, but the title of the film is La Casa Chica, which is translated to the small house. And the plot is that Fernando Mendoza, an eminent doctor, falls in love with Amalia, which we see in the image, a sweet woman that fully reciprocates. But Fernando is engaged to marry Lucila, a frivolous woman who uses 1,000 wiles to keep him. Over the years, the stormy relationship between Fernando and Amalia becomes more complicated. She finishes her medical studies and becomes a very prestigious scientist. Amalia agrees to become Fernando's lover and collaborates with him in his laboratory as his assistant. They share an apartment, the house of the other, or the small house, where they enjoy their pure and sincere love. And what we also see in the background is Diego Rivera's work. And this is the last part of the scene in this movie, and it's a crucial point where the class difference collides in space, or actually in place. And it's happening at the Palace of Fine Art in Mexico City during Diego Rivera's retrospective. This is another example of how class takes place and actually becomes place. We're going to take a look at the actual images in color that you see. You see the main character in the center of the screen, and you see a monument, and then on the left you also see a painting. And this is a close-up of these two images. The scene ends when Amalia realizes the immorality of her relationship with Dr. Mendoza. She leans onto Coatlicue, the mother of all Aztec gods, and the Mexican, and also the mother of the Mexican nation, having also as backdrop a contemporary image of the goddess made by Diego Rivera. So we see Coatlicue on the left, which is in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, and then also Pan American Unity, which is a mural painted by Diego Rivera for the Art in Action exhibition, Treasure Island Golden Gate International Exposition in San Francisco in 1940. So Mexico's Sentimental National Project. And I'm using here a quote by Justino Fernandez, which is one of the most important prominent and art critics of Mexican art. And with this quote, he's framing how the art of Mexico should be framed. All that I have said and presented in chronological order is rather conventional. Actually, we live the past and the present through art simultaneously. And when dealing with Mexican art, we perceive in works of art, one time and another, tragic beauty in the interplay of life and death. At this point, one has to comprehend a paradox. If it is true that there is a tragic sense of existing in Mexican art, one who has to acknowledge that it is revealed by artistic and aesthetic forms, that is given birth by the joy of creating. Thus, joy and drama go together. The joy to give aesthetic life to the tragic sense of existence, a way of consolation, a spiritual cure to our finitude. And again, this is a very sentimental text. And I proceed with another example by Diego Rivera. And this is a quote that he expressed about the National Museum of Mexico, which eventually became the Anthropology Museum, which is the next example that we will look at. Only Indians, gente de calzón blanco, go to the national museums with their hearts full of devotion and lively sensibility. And this image is from Picturesque Mexico, Artistic and Monumental by Manuel Rivera Cambas. And I'm going to read a quote by Manuel Rivera Cambas. That stone, is referring to the calendar that we're looking at, the illustration, is also an authentic testimony that the Aztecs had advanced a lot in the science of movement and in the knowledge of the revolutions of the stars. And despite what can be said to the contrary for many wise men, there is reflected the faithful expression of the calendar, so arranged and perfect, that some nations of that time had not reached the advancement that the Mexican people had achieved. And again, we have to think about essentialism, otherness, and absences to recreate the national place, or the national space, which is actually place. Now, here is an image of the Museum of Anthropology, which is actually located in the center of Mexico City. And Mexico City was imagined as the belly button, the center. And at the center of the center, there is a museum. And the whole museum was designed with a very specific spatial strategy. What we see here is the umbrella. It's a bronze column located in the central courtyard of the National Museum of Anthropology. And it was a project designed by the Chavez Morado brothers, Jose and Tomás, to represent the integration and projection of Mexico as a country. By respecting the constructive solution of the column, a fusion between sculpture and architecture, it was achieved. And the theme of integration or mestizaje revolves from the West, the cardinal point for which Western cultures, meaning Spaniards, arrived to Mexico, to the other directions in the column, and the other directions of the column speak about other myths. The great area of the patio tries to recreate the same spatial sensation of greatness of pre-Hispanic spaces. All interiors were designed with native materials from stones, tropical woods from Querétaro, and some from Puebla. Now, about the Museum of Anthropology. It's a project that was governed in all of its aspects, from the architectural design to its interiors. Multiple artists, intellectuals, and experts were commissioned for the project that was designed by architect Pedro Ramirez Vázquez. The purpose was to make the museum a necessary permanent lesson to the people, to make it a teaching spectacle, showing the past as an inspiration of the necessary encouragement for the future. The museum is designed using multiple technologies of spatialization, from maps, landscape, and painting, and these are organized as absences to guide visitors and place their embodied experience in history. It functions as a mechanism that puts into practice essentialism, recreates a process of othering, and articulates absences to produce the proper kind of viewer by teaching how to feel right and act right. And here we have some example of the interior of the museum. We see on the right, in the back of the right part of the photo, an image of a painting by Ricardo Martinez, which was a Mexican painter. And it was noted, it was known for his figurative work of unreal atmospheres, including still lifes, landscapes, and depictions of indigenous people and children, often with nationalistic elements. The Museum of Anthropology was inaugurated on September 17, 1964, and it is the largest and most visited museum in Mexico. It is regarded as the monument of monuments, a national symbol of pride, a reference to the tradition of museums around the globe. And this is a very interesting quote that I found about the Museum of Anthropology and the collection that it has, that is actually from the 20th century. And it's a quote by Teresa Del Conte, which is also a very well-known art critic. The first thing that must be taken into account when making judgments or comments about the art of the 20th century that houses the National Museum of Anthropology is that, except for what is integrated into architecture, what exists there is not a primary nature, but of a complementary nature. Its function is, on the one hand, illustrative or emblematic, and on the other, decorative. And this is another example of the apparent absences that are constituted or are used to constitute place. And this is how also class becomes a place. Here is another image where we see the work of a modern painter in the background, in contrast with the different sculptures that we see as part of the Hispanic art that is hosted in the museum, and also a viewer placed in the center. Sentimentality, defined from Shirley Samuel's The Culture of Sentiment, this is how we define it: as a set of cultural practices designed to evoke a certain form of emotional response, usually empathy. In the reader or viewer, sentimentality produces or reproduces spectacles that cross race, class, and gender boundaries. Sentimentality acts in conjunction with the problem of the body and what it embodies, how social, political, racial, and gender meanings are determined through their differential embodiments. The fourth and last example is Teresa Margolis at the 53rd edition of the Venice Biennale. It is a project that was designed, created by Teresa Margolis and curated by Cuauhtemoc Medina, where the artist and the curator were actually selected to represent Mexico, to be hosted in the Mexican Pavilion and represent Mexico. And the title of the project is What Else Could We Talk About? Teresa Margolis' work, an installation, and a series of public actions and interventions for the Mexican Pavilion is centered in and around the palace, a specific palace in Venice. Teresa Margolis explores death as a subject and relates it to social and economic inequalities. Initially using the morgue as a laboratory to develop her conceptual strategies, she later moved her focus onto the crime scenes, the streets where the growing violence of drug-related killings in Mexico take place. And again, here is very important to understand how her practice recreates the idea of place, the idea of Mexico and death. Here's some important information about Teresa Margolis as an artist. She's a conceptual artist, photographer, videographer, and performance artist. As an artist, she researches the social causes and consequences of death. Margolis communicates observations from her own morgue in Mexico City and other morgues located in Latin America, as well as the extended emotional distress and social consequences that occur as product of death by murder. While working around the topic of the body, her work extends to the families of the victims, the remaining living bodies that witness the death of a loved one. The main medium of her work comes from the morgues themselves, which she transforms into sensory experience that provoke a feeling of memory to the audience. Margolis finds particularly remarkable how the activity inside the morgues reflect the truth from the outside. In the case of Mexico City, she observes that the majority of victims belong to the lower classes. And again, this is something that even Linda Nochlin talks about when she talks about the absences in art. And we should never forget that the question of art is always a question of art. It's never the question of reality. Art can be inspired by reality, but art is not reality. And we see how the specific terms are being used to recreate place and recreate history in her statement. The installation that she presented at the Venice Biennale consisted of a set of 7 pieces that subtly intervened the space. However, in symbolic terms, it was impossible to be unnoticed since the objective was to make an approach to encourage and involve the audience's reflection. The work of Margolis has been known for confronting violence, death, and loss from a provocative and overwhelming posture, and also for using human remains as artistic material. Taking the wave of violence generated in Mexico by the war against drug as context, Margolis did necrogeographic journeys. And again, this is how the technology of spatialization is used, where she made visual and sound records of the territories wounded by death, again, a map. She also picked up waste like mud, blood, and pieces of glass, which she later used for the creation of 7 installations that reflected abjection and shocked the visitor. Blood in pregnant fabric, glass pieces used in exact replicas of the jewelry used by the criminals, and the sound recordings played in an empty hall. With this work, the artist insists on the importance of art as a catalyst of and multiplier of questions of individuals in the surroundings. And this is a very interesting quote by Oriana Badley that explains a little bit more how the work of Margolis, when we think about the technologies that create space and make class become a place, function. It is, of course, not possible to discuss Margolis' work as an artist without recognizing that it is interwoven with her training as a forensic technician and her roles within the morgues in Mexico City. It is an aspect of her biography that appears to have both fascinated the art world and tied her work into the aforementioned widespread obsession with the materiality of death. It is this biographical detail that somehow imparts the works with credibility, their contamination made believable by the artist's own experience. However, an interesting question in relation to Margolis is how important in that fascination is the juxtaposition of geography and theme, of death and Mexico. Is the combination of gender, geographical location, and iconographic tradition of relevance in understanding a response to her work? Would any more do, or does that of Mexico City carry its own dimension of meaning? And again, this is how the recreation of place is happening over and over again. So now we have to ask the question of the body. What is the body? And these points are the conclusion from a conversation about the relationship between the body and landscape as genres in art with Dr. Kristen Pye Buick. According to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the body is a historical idea rather than a natural species. The body is an active process of embodying certain cultural and historical possibilities. It is a verb rather than a noun. It is a process rather than a thing. It is a symbol, a resource, a medium, a system of delivery, communication, and a communicating agent. It doesn't merely signify or symbolize power relations. Hatred is the fury of those who do not share our goals, and its object is death and destruction. Anger is the grief of distortions between peers, and its object is change. It implies peers meeting upon a common basis to examine difference and to alter those distortions which history has created around difference. For it those distortions which separate us, and we must ask ourselves who profits from all of this. And this is a quote from Audre Lorde. And this is my conclusion on how do we move from here. The ideal of freedom is rooted in the self. Thus, justice is not a consequential result from the intimacy of any encounter, nor from our intentions, even if we choose to respond responsibly and act with accountability. As Christian Buick asserts, we're operating in very old structures, and ideology continually tries to distort space into place and time into history. As we move in space and time, we encounter, and the encounter with the other, autrui, we assume an understanding based on the technologies of spatialization, the framework of history and place. However, the encounter consists of the fact that we do not possess autrui despite the extent of domination and or slavery. Although everything coming to me from autrui because of the body and spatialization seems to be offered for my comprehension and possession. In each encounter, we have to be aware that what actually escapes our comprehension from autrui is the impossibility of being always, the presence of the eternity of the one self. Thank you so much. And I wanna now open the mic so that people can ask any questions about the practice, anything in general.
Thank you so much, Francisco. That was
Absolutely
fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Let's see. So now we have time, right, for questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way that this webinar is set up, I can give you access to the microphone, but I don't think you can do it on your own. Or if anyone has any questions already, they could write it in the chat. Mm-hmm. We can address them that way as well. But I see a raised hand. Oh, we can also raise hands on the list of participants, and then you can raise your hand there. And I see there's a raised hand. All right, here we have our first question. Oops.
Sure.
Where'd they go? Oh, Nancy, did you want to? I saw someone raise their hand and now it's gone. Okay. I will start with a question, and then maybe we'll see a hand raise again. So I was wondering, how have you observed just with the situation of the pandemic and living in this virtual world of technology, mm-hmm. How have you found the framework of I guess spatialization and relations face to face being affected over Zoom?
Right. Well, it is a very relevant question when we think about our practices, because this is something that we have been talking about at Arquetopia for many years through the process of establishing the residency first in Puebla, Oaxaca, then in Peru, and then in Italy. We discovered that place is a problem. As you know, we hosted recently a symposium on the problem of the grand tour as the legacy that informs most artistic practices, including museums, universities, and of course, artist residencies. And throughout the years, we discovered that the residency is actually the face-to-face encounter. It's not the space, it's actually not the place. It is a space, because space is a relationship. Just like time is a relationship, space is a relationship. So what we learned through the process is that things needed to change. One of the biggest challenges that we face when we travel through through the world in general is that we imagine that we travel through time. So whenever we host residents from any part of the world, they imagine, not necessarily consciously, but as part of the whole rhetoric of the structures in which we operate, that we live in the past or that they're going to encounter the past. And if you think about how the process of the consolidation of images and the visual culture of Mexico is articulated, is in that same sense. So one of the things that this pandemic made relevant is the reality that time and space are a relationship. And as a relationship, there is a responsibility. There is the necessity of reciprocity. So it has changed the whole world. I think what is interesting in terms of the aftermath of the pandemic is how are we going to relate to place and history when we need to rethink time and space? Because one of the things that have been seeing everywhere in the world is that museums are in a very critical point. You know, recently I read the news where the museum, one museum in Brooklyn was actually selling one of its pieces to be able to survive. And this is the first time in probably 300 or 400 years, you know, as collections were amassed and then turned into museums, that it is happening. Yes, of course, museums have sold their work before to acquire new pieces, but to imagine that the space, the place itself, and this is also a very interesting place to think about, because it's also imagined as if you could control time as you move through the past. Are in danger is a very interesting question. So in a sense, what is relevant to our practice that Zoom meetings and the pandemic made relevant is the necessity to establish and correct place and history to bring it back to the notion of space and time.
Thank you for your answer.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, we have a question from Emmanuel Ortega. How do you avoid the problem of the body as a constituent of space in your work?
It's a very big challenge because the body is a signifier and it's performative. And as I mentioned in the process of the lecture, the body is recreated by the nation, and the body also determines the degree of freedom that we enjoy. And of course, this is performative, this is in time, and you know, this is in history and place. So it changes, it's never permanent. And I don't really have an answer. I discover the answers as I do the work, because I found in Nicholas Mirtsov's reading Empty the Museum that art is highly invested in celebrating extermination, in celebrating the extinction of the environment, and also the appropriation of labor. When we look at the art world, and this is also something very interesting related to your question, the art world is gone. It's dead. It would have to rediscover itself to figure out what is next. But the gallery system as it was established, the way auctions work, the way empire was looting specific communities, it came to an end. It doesn't mean that the next step is going to be better, but it does mean that it's the end. So how do I tackle the body is one of the biggest struggles that I had to encounter and face throughout my practice. I think the example of the installations was the first, and I didn't realize until I had to prepare this lecture. I have been obsessed with how class is spatialized, how class becomes a place. And then when I thought about it, I found how the national rhetoric reenacts this process. So it is a very complicated tradition that is very difficult to challenge. And as I mentioned in the lecture, Kirsten Buick says, we are operating in very old structures. So the first approach to the project that I'm working on currently of painting and indigo had, I was using cartoons from the 19th century trying to challenge the notion of the body. And what I tried to do is erase those cartoons and fill them with the strategies, language, music, strategies that allow certain bodies that were ostracized from official history to exist or to actually survive. But what I found out is that cartoons also function as a hinge that situates the viewer in relation to the moral duty that they have to the nation. So the work failed. And this is actually the paintings that you see on my left here that are, it incorporates some images of Casa Paintings, textiles in the background, which is the indigo that you see, and then some lyrics. And the recent work that I've been doing is looking at other ways of looking at other technologies of spatialization. It is very early in the stages, but I have found that the tradition in Mesoamerica of spatialization, of creating space, was different than what Europeans brought, because maps made territories legible and easy to conquer. And in Mesoamerica, time was a constant that was necessary to understand space, not place, but space. So what I've been using is other ways of looking at space and time, and then insert that or overlap that with the body or the actual absence of the body. And from there, I also use certain markers of the limits of the embodied experience, because as I mentioned at the end of the presentation, we are not the body. We are much more than the body. What the body does is that it makes us legible. It renders history and place, and it makes us think that we can see the other person when in fact we can't. We can't see eternity. We can't understand that greatness that is being presented in front of ourselves, or we are being presented in front of someone else. So I take those limits, which are usually patterns in the way garments are constructed, but also iconography, texture that has been used through the history of painting to recreate the problem of class as a place. And then I disassemble that and reassemble it, and something different happens. Not necessarily that it's successful, not necessarily that it fails, but it's the only possibility that I have as part of my practice, just like with Arquetopia, it is to interrupt. My goal is to interrupt history, to interrupt place.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I have a couple more questions here, which is great. From Victoria in the chat, we have, thank you, Francisco Guevara, for the depth of what you're sharing here. This fascinating information has made me wonder about the existence of soundscapes of space that reflect space in Mexico, more specifically. What examples of the exploration of soundscapes of the past through writing, visual, or performance art?
Well, the problem is that anything that is a landscape is a problem. What we need to identify is the difference between time, space, and place and history. And this is, again, what I mentioned at the beginning. Place is dead, space is actualized. So one of the challenges that I'm always presenting to residents through our programs is, how can we correct time and space? And these are all illusions. It doesn't mean that time and space can actually be distorted into place and history. This is something that we imagine and we enjoy. But what we have to do is correct that notion and bring it back to the relationship that it is. Space and time are relationships. Because, and so much so, and going back to the question that you're asking about Zoom, so much so that this space is being actualized because of the relationship. It doesn't really exist. It's just a series of one and zeros. It's just a series of, electrical, images, sounds, whatever it is, but it doesn't really exist in what we understand as the physical world. So space and times are only actualized when we encounter, and as we move, we encounter. So the problem is always landscape, and landscape seems to be natural, seems to be real. And remember that one of the elements that we have to think about is we should never make art an absence, meaning understanding art as reality and imagining that it's absent of the conversation. Art and the work of an artist is just one single opinion among a notion of opinions. It's not reality. It's not the real world. It's just a perspective in terms of a specific theme and specific ideas. So how to answer that would have to be, what I always suggest is we need to think about artistic agency, not artistic intention. What we intended as artists always fails and never matters. What matters is artistic agency, and artistic agency is a capacity to react in context. So I'm always challenging artists to think about artistic agency and in what context they want it to perform. And from there, what I do is I made them think about their obsession, because for instance, I'm obsessed with class and place, or class being spatialized. So instead of turning that into a statement, I pose it as a question. Because the reality that the body is limiting my experience and limiting the possibility of connecting with others is also the reality that my experience is the only experience I have, which makes it valid. So it is valid to ask questions, but it is not necessarily valid to make statements.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I have a question in the question and answer chat from Elena Kalkova that says, thank you so much, Francisco. I have a question about the work you showed from the Venice Biennale. What else can you talk about? What else can we talk about? Do you think it adds an extra layer of meaning by being presented at the Venice Biennale, since the Biennale is also a place that brings a lot of questions about class, place, and space?
Right. No, because the reality, and as I showed in the presentation, we are living in a world as an exhibition. And throughout the symposium that we had recently, Kirsten Bieg also gave a quote that said, it's not the world as an exhibition, it's actually the world as a zoo. And the reality is that all these structures are very old. Biennales are actually rooted in universal expositions. And thinking that art can change by the experience of art is not possible. Art is certainly very powerful. Art certainly has the potential, but because intention always fails or falls short, what we need to understand is artistic agency. Now, this is a very interesting question, because what is next in terms of this reality that we are facing, and really the pandemic didn't make it happen. It only made it faster. The effect of capitalism and the effect of how space and times are necessary to be rethought, or how we need to think about it. And it was necessary, but it's not really that the pandemic created that effect. And this is a very interesting question when we think about biennales. How will we relate to the work? I don't have answers for that. But it is certainly interesting to think about these examples, because we see how these long-lasting tradition that I only presented it starting the end of the 19th century all the way to the 20th century, and specifically the Venice Biennale, the 53rd Biennale. It's only, and because of time, it's only a short segment of what I think is a tradition of making class into a place. But it probably goes back, it dates back further, as I show in some of the Casa Paintings, but who knows how it's going to happen, because as we know, we have been pushing for change. How the reaction of the system will react in relation to our actions, we don't know yet, which is a very interesting question.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I know Carmen has a question that she'd like to ask.
So I was kind of wondering if you might be able to talk about kind of the concept of gentrification in terms of place. And I was wondering if we could talk about maybe these kind of current issues about how, you know, place is being made consistently, and that kind of construct that we see is based on class and based on all these kind of informative assumptions of our social sphere. But what do you think about kind of what's happening right now on terms, like, in terms of a planetary issue, or like, you know, the empire just kind of grabbing at all the resources? It's like, you know, if we don't have space to live, especially like indigenous peoples or any of peoples who are oppressed kind of by the empire or by the class structure, you know, like what do you foresee as the next step? Because I kind of just see, you know, like the empire keeps taking space, and this idea of gentrification is applied to the whole planet, and it's you know, a mass scale, so it's like expanding that space, and people are just consistently moving all over just to try to survive. And at the same time, you have this kind of overarching like empirical narrative. Well, if this doesn't work out here on this planet, we've got this rocket ship and we're gonna like go into space and terraform Mars, and we'll find a new place to make. And so I'm kind of thinking about it in terms of like, you know, timescape. How do we begin to enter into these timescapes that help us to understand how place is and class is taking over the planet?
Right. The first thing is that we need to understand that class and race operate together. They are chameleonic, which means they change form. And this is why racism is always taking place in different ways throughout history, but also class. And they attach to each other and they operate together depending on the space. I don't think there's a space or actually a place on Earth that has not been colonized. The only space that has not been colonized yet is a face-to-face encounter, because it can't be predicted. Now, this big question that you are asking is a wonderful question that Dipesh Chakrabarty brought up as part of the series of discussions that we had during our last symposium on the Grand Tour. Because he also mentioned that it is the first time that three histories are colliding: the history of the universe, the history of life, and the history of humans. And what we have not realized, and that also provokes an emotional response, is how we relate to this problem. It's usually a response to the polar bear dying in the middle of the ocean, which is the best example of an emotional response that is also organized by empire and nationalism. The reality is that we have provoked such a change in the world that it would take several million years, thousands of years, I don't know if millions, but at least thousands of years, to correct or to change. What we have imposed on Earth, and this is not necessarily with a moral sense, but it is happening in terms of scientific data, which is also an invention, that's another story, but it is reflecting that the change that we have inflicted on Earth, it has the same scale as a planetary influence on Earth. So this brings back the notion of these three histories, and a very important moment in our history that makes us try to understand if it even makes sense to make art. And that's something that we have to think about. Does it really matter? Yes and no, because the scale is greater than anything that we can imagine. However, I also think that our job here as artists, our job here as creators, as anyone who's invested in changing what is happening is interruption. One of the things that Audre Lorde mentioned is that change is painful. There is no change without pain. However, because change cannot be predicted, it is necessary, the only possibility that is necessary for this to happen is to interrupt it. So I don't really have an answer except the commitment to create interruptions. The only reality that I can understand is mine. However, I do know that by interrupting place and history, something will change. And it doesn't mean it will be pleasant. It doesn't mean it's just a battle that we won. It is probably very close to what we have experienced to the pandemic. We all have said at some point or another that change was needed. Now, this change that just happened is going to be extremely painful for millions of people.
Thank you so much. Let's see, we're getting near to the end of our time that we have with you, but can I ask another question that we have in the...
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So this is from Ishlar Muzaffar, and he says, thank you for wonderful talk. I'm fascinated by your conclusion, the idea of the body as a process. Isn't it more productive than to consider body itself as a sedimentation of all sorts of discriminations, from access to food and health to exposure to toxins and violence, rather than explain power through a theory of space?
Right, and something that we should always think about is these three aspects that many scholars have articulated differently. When we think about the body, when we think about landscape, soundscapes, any kind of representation of place, we always need to look for essentialism, otherness, and the absences. And this is specifically, absences are very relevant to what we do, because it is imagined as if art were not really a conversation about art, but a conversation about reality. It is imagined that art can represent, without ideology, anything that we do. But when we look at the strategies that are used to recreate space, from, for instance, the Museum of Anthropology, the Venice Biennale, even a performance of Teresa Margolis in the middle of nowhere in Mexico and then presented in a different context, or Diego Rivera, everything is geared to imagine essentialism, otherness, and to recreate these absences.
Amazing, thank you. I have one more question. I'm interested in your perspective on how the role of the academy, and how can we, let's see, how do you view the role of the academy and academic potentials for historical and ideological interruptions within the academy, being that academic institutions uphold so many of their own limitations. Yeah, so just a lot of us are, right, in university.
Right. Well, I don't have faith, because faith is a form of empathy. It makes you, an empathy in the context of Emmanuel Levinas, it makes you think that you do when you're actually not doing anything. It makes you, usually it gears towards colonization. It is recreating your own idea about something without allowing anything to exist without your perspective. And this is the whole legacy of continental philosophy. With that said, I don't have any faith in any institution. It is impossible to not participate. It is impossible not to engage with them. This is something I have questioned myself when we established Arquetopia as a foundation, as an institution, as a residency. This is also why we try to challenge, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, to bring back the conversation to space and time. The residency is the encounter. Kirsten Buick, which is a wonderful scholar, she teaches at the University of New Mexico every summer, except for this one because the world was crazy, gives a lecture on how to survive institutions, how to survive a graduate program. And this is a reality. We are operating in very old structures. It is impossible to not feel the weight of history and the structure of place. But I don't think it is an option to not participate. I don't think it's an option not to go to school, or that school is the only option. You know, there are many avenues for what we do. What we need to keep in mind is that the only solution, and it will take many different forms and many possibilities, and depending on the resources that we have, and I don't mean economic resources, but in general, the resources that we have within our communities and families and friends and etc. It is interruption. We sense when interruption is needed. And there is amazing work that is being produced in institutions, but despite of the history of institutions. The reality is that the world, as it has been organized as an exhibition, touches every single aspect, from tourism to education to the fashion industry. Nothing is exempt. There is no place on earth that has not been colonized. However, the only space, not place, space that has not been colonized yet is a face-to-face encounter. Because there's an instant in which we can glance at each other and we can see beyond the body, and we can understand that the existence is greater in eternity than anything that we can comprehend. And despite of place and history, because it's the only thing that we can read through the body, we're able to grasp that, even if it's just an instant. To me, that is what, if I could have faith, renew my faith in artists, because art makes things worse. It makes it even worse than anything. So, or as it was. However, artists, although they might make it worse, they remain in the struggle, and they choose their questions, and they wrestle with the question usually their whole lives. With this process, they allow certain things to be interrupted and the work to be continued by other artists and scholars as well. So we are operating in very old structures, which gives us some sort of feeling that we're doomed, which is true, but also in a sense, because time and space cannot be controlled, it also gives us the possibility of change for the future. So that's my complicated answer.
I love it. Thank you so much. I have already kept you a little bit over what we said we would, so I think we have to finish this lovely talk. But thank you so much for your discussion, your time, your thorough and complex ideas. I know we're all very grateful and appreciate that you've taken the time to, do this lecture with us today.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. It was an honor. I think you also mentioned that this session has been recorded for anyone who is was not able to attend. So we'll share the link to anyone who's interested and who was not able to be part of this discussion.
Yes, absolutely. I know there's parts that I'm going to go and rewatch again, go find things. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also added my email to the presentation. If any of you have questions, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to respond.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Francisco. And thank you everybody for joining this talk today. Bye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye.